like to invite to the table also Professor Diana Hicks, Professor James Wilsdon, Professor Diana Hicks from School of Public Policy, Georgia Institute of Technology, and Professor James Wilsdon from the UCL, University College London, where he is a director of the Research on Research Institute. Before passing the word to Fernando to chair this table, I made a very unforgiven mistake this morning. I forgot to mention two people that were absolutely central in the organization of this event. Nobody told me after this. I remember this. When I stepped down here, I realized that I didn't mention two people that have helped us very much. Mariana Ceci, a journalist who is here. Thank you for all your help, Mariana, and Vinicius Muraro, who is living in Sweden, but from Sweden, he helped us very much here. So thank you. So now I pass the word to Fernando Rizzo to chair this table. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a really big pleasure to be here. We would like also to congratulate the FAPESP for this event, also the job at Unicamp, where we have now this program going on even tomorrow. And I have a special pleasure to be in this position because I had the opportunity to know James Wilsdon for quite a long time. Where he was already at CGEE from 2006 to 2014, and by that time, CGEE was invited to take part in a study called Atlas of Ideas, which was from think tank Demos in UK. And then was when I met for the first time James Wilsdon and then Kirsten Bound, the people who did this study with us. And I'd like just to point out this was around 2006 or 7. And this project, which was designed by them, was precisely the idea, the Atlas of Ideas, that innovation was not coming necessarily from central countries. And they had already done studies on China, India, and Korea. And it was very interesting because, and then Brazil was selected to be the 4th country, and we had the opportunity to work with them. And so from then on, I could follow James when he went to the Royal Society, and then to Brighton, then Sussex, and then Sheffield, and now he's back at UCL. And so it's very good pleasure to meet him. I also met the Dr. Diana Hicks from Georgia Tech. It's also pleasures. And so you have two experts here to talk about the problem of research funding. And it's quite interesting to listen about what both could come. And in the case of James, he just finished this meta-science in 2015, who was mentioned by Sergio in the morning. And so he probably can give a broad idea about different countries. And at the same time, which is something that is very important for today, is to listen to Diana mention about the situation probably in the United States. I understand that she's going to also talk to us what are the perspectives. So I'm sure that you have a very interesting talk, and I would not like to take more time again, and then thank both for the presence and inviting them, James, to give a talk, please.
Great. Well, thank you, Fernando, very much for that kind introduction. And my thanks to colleagues at FAPESP and to Sergio and colleagues at GOP for the invitation to be here. It's lovely to be back in Sao Paulo after, for me, quite a few years away. But as Fernando just reminded us, I was here for quite regularly for a period when we were working on this study that we did, as you just heard, jointly with CGEE back 19 years ago we started it, which makes me feel old. But, and for me it was a fantastic opportunity to sort of do a deep dive into all sorts of aspects of what was going on then across different parts of Brazil, in science, technology, and it was a report done jointly with the UK, partly to try and make the UK system more aware of the range and quality and depth, diversity of activity that was happening in science innovation here, and also the potential for its further growth and development over the years that followed, which I think perhaps unevenly in some years, but generally has been the case. So it's really nice to be back with you all. So I'm going to talk, as Fernando says, I'm going to kind of give a very sort of panoramic overview, if I can, of some things that are happening. Sergio asked me to focus my remarks on what we see happening in the worlds of research funding and among research funders. And my institute, Rory, works primarily with research funders, foundations, public funders. We have 55 partners now in 21 countries. So it's a mix. I mean, we have academics, obviously, also working in Rory, but the core of the model of what we do is to try and do science of innovation with the agencies that develop and run science funding systems around the world. So it's about half and half public funders and private foundations. And you can see more that report came out last week to coincide with, you've heard already today about Metascience 2025. I feel a bit, it's not very great to turn up and tell you all about a party that happened last week that you weren't at, but some of you were. Adriana, Sergio were there, and I think maybe one or two others in the audience, so I won't dwell on the event, but I'm going to draw some of the material from that event simply because it was a big coming together of lots of different actors in these debates, academic funders, policy, and others, from quite a wide range of countries, as I'll show in a second. I wanted to talk, drawing a bit on one of the sessions that we had at that meeting, which had this title of Frontiers of Funding, sort of to talk about 5 faces of research funding in 2025, which you can see summarized here. I'll just run through quick. So funders as active participants in the meta-science movement, which I'll describe in a moment. Funders as sites of experimentation, and we've heard some great examples of work that FPESP is supporting here that very much fits that mold, I think, which is fantastic to see. Funders as investors in novel infrastructures, funders as shapers of assessment reform, and then finally, the one that's, I suppose, the least positive of the list, funders in crisis, funders struggling to maintain their legitimacy and their social license. Which, of course, will, I hope, segue very nicely into what Diana will talk about more in the US. But, I mean, it isn't just an issue for the US, of course. It's an issue for many, many countries in different ways. So to whiz through these, and I should say I'll put these slides will all go up on the Rory Figshare at the end. I was halfway through doing the upload, but I had to stop to do the talk. So I'll put them up so you can get them afterwards. Funders as active participants in meta-science. I mean, meta-science, we could talk for a separate 20 minutes about what is meta-science. I don't think it's helpful to get hung up on these terms and the jargon. Meta-science, meta-research, science of science, research on research are all terms that have different genealogies and slightly different histories, but are all being used with more frequency and visibility across global science policy. And meta-science probably among them is the one that has become the most widely applied, and as represented by the meta-science conferences, is an umbrella, a big tent under which many tribes and communities can congregate and exchange ideas, evidence, and work together on agendas for reform. So we had this big meeting last week. There were 800 or so people there from 65 countries, including a good show from Brazil, which was great. And hopefully you can see on that slide down at the bottom there, just to show you the composition of these conferences. So this is the 4th of these meta-science conferences that's taken place. Previously, they were always in the US. They began at Stanford. The last one, it's every 2 years. The last one in 2023 was at the National Academies in Washington, and there were about 260, 70 people there. This time, obviously, 800 people. And you can see from the list there, academics, researchers, PhD students still make up a good solid half of that audience. They're a very central part of this. But there is also now growing presence and engagement in these discussions from funders, public funding agencies and foundations. See, there were about 130 or so from across the funding space, other NGOs, tech companies, publishers, policymakers from central governments, national academies, etc. So it's becoming a more representative community in terms of the different parts of the global research system, which is interesting in lots of ways. We heard in the opening plenary of that meeting last week a speech from this guy, Patrick Vallance, who is the Minister for Science in the British government. And he was there to launch this report, A Year in Metascience, which is the first big public document to come out of the new-ish, well, now over a year old, nearly 18 months, the new UK Metascience Unit. And this was something that was set up, quite a novel thing. I mean, it's not, one could argue, maybe Kay would argue, that the OSTP in its own sense is a metascience unit. It's not the first centre for this kind of work in a government, but it's, I think, the first one to use the word metascience. And it sits kind of astride the ministry in our government, the Department for Science, Innovation, Technology, and UKRI, the big national funding agency. So it's made up of a small team, half and half civil servants from the central government, and then senior staff from the Funding Council. And the goal of the Metascience Unit is basically to scale up, accelerate the volume and quality and rigor of meta-scientific experimentation taking place across the UK funding system, to support meta-scientific work through the wider research system, through grants and support for other academics doing this work. And thirdly, to act as a sort of champion for this kind of approach to the management of R&D budgets across the central government. So UKRI, our national funding agency, is the biggest single spender of public money on university-based research. But of course, in the UK, as in most countries, there's lots of investment in R&D that takes place in other parts of government, defence, health, environment, etc. And so the Metascience Unit is also trying to sort of spread the meta-scientific ways of thinking through the rest of the government science spend. So, yeah, really interesting report. You can get it online. And we wrote, this is actually the annex I'm showing you here, the past, present, future of UK meta-science, which is the annex which my team wrote to try and give a flavour of sort of, well, what is meta-science, where's it come from, where might it be going? So if you're interested in, there's lots in there about definitions and what's new and what's old, which I won't go into now. But, I'm starting with the UK because, obviously, I'm from the UK, but there's lots of related initiatives happening all over the place. I mean, the US is obviously a complicated data point in this global picture, which I say Diana will elaborate on more than me. But in general, we see across a significant number of countries a sort of scaling up in the level, intensity of ambition in this regard. So just a few examples here. A recent joint funding call from the Canadian public funders on research. The one in there in the middle is the Volkswagen Foundation in Germany, which has now quite an active program of support for researching research. It sounds better in German, but UKRI I've mentioned. Down the bottom there, that's the French government who have sort of approached this through the lens first of open science as it then goes into meta-science, and it's a sort of program to support research on open science. In the middle there is an early draft of part of the next Japanese STI basic plan, which will come out later in the year. And we had at Metascience 25, Takahiro Ueyama, who is the main guy who is working in the Cabinet Office in Japan, leading the development of the next 5-year strategy for the Japanese system. Ireland there as well. We could give lots of examples. To focus on a couple of particular interests, the EU So in the European framework programs, we're obviously now entering the latter part of Horizon Europe as Framework Programme 9, and there's a very, very lively debate, quite heated debate in Brussels and across European science about the shape and focus and structure of what will become Framework 10, which will start in 2028. There have been a number of big reviews published of the current system and recommendations for the future of the system. One of the most significant of those is this report, Align, Act, Accelerate, the so-called Heitor report, which was produced by Manuel Heitor, the former Portuguese science minister, and an expert group. And within a whole range of things that it says, they have a very strong push for Framework 10 to be characterized by a much more expansive program of experimentation, testing new models of funding evaluation in various ways. They actually say the EU should immediately establish an experiment unit even before the end of the current framework. So that debate is very live. We heard a lot about that last week. China, again, I mean, has been doing science of science in lots of ways for a long time. I think Diana was at the Shanghai Institute for Science of Science just recently. I was there last year. And that's been around since 1980 as an institute doing this stuff. But there is also there, I think, a fresh push to scale up what they're doing, how they're doing it, at a number of different levels. We see within the NSFC, the National Science Funding Council, the National Natural Science Funding Council of China, a big body of work now going on to sort of rethink how they manage the system, trying out various things. Chinese Academy of Sciences as well. There's a lot, and we had both groups again at the meeting last week. So lots happening. I haven't really gone into the definition stuff, but meta science today, as we see it, sort of, this is someone else's diagram. This comes from a nice paper by Peterson-Panofsky that came out came out from the first meta science conference in Stanford, and they describe it, as you can see here, as the sort of coming together of these three streams of activity and academic work, people coming from the open science movement, and these conferences were set up and are still primarily led by the Center for Open Science in the States. You've then got the science of science movement. I put John Marburger there as a sort of face of the origins of this, in recent times at least, the Science of Science Policy program as it developed at the NSF. And then you've got the methodological activists, the reproducibility movement, people who are concerned about questionable research practices. And so, meta-science is a sort of place where all of these different communities can congregate and gather. This is another way of looking, if you like, in a timeline way that's in the report we did for the British government. But, my argument would be that these four terms, some people will argue ad nauseam that there's subtle distinctions between these four words. I, for the purposes of everyday language and function, I would argue that they are effectively synonyms. And of course, importantly, they are synonyms that are also very, very much infused by building on, drawing on the century or more of work that lies behind them in fields like STS, innovation studies, higher education studies, scientometrics, etc. So, we need to be very conscious of what's new, what's old. There is also new stuff happening, and I think that is also what makes the field very exciting. To just focus briefly on the kind of academic side of all of this, this is some work that I've done with colleagues at Leiden that's again in the UK government report, and I won't go into it because of time, but this is a visualization of publications over the last 10 years that could broadly be seen as covering meta-scientific topics. And so up there in the red, you've got the big, large clumps and circles that represent those established disciplinary communities that we would expect to have published lots of work on this. That's not very surprising. What I think is exciting is the spread, the distribution of the small dots across the rest of the science system. And that is, I think, where meta-science as a movement, if you like, in academic terms, derives a lot of its energy and dynamism and innovation from. It's researchers in almost every field of science who are often in their spare time, I say in my piece for the government, as a side hustle. They're doing meta-science on a Friday in the lab when they finish their main project, and they're taking the tools, the methods that they've developed and honed in their home discipline, and they're directing that methodological capability at issues, problems, obstacles that they're encountering in science, whether that's to do with how the grant system works, or how assessment works, or issues around gender inequality, or just wanting to make the system more agile and less bureaucratic and sclerotic. And so you've got this great surge of stuff, and at the same time you've got a lower barrier to entry in terms of the capacity of many academics, all academics, to use a lot of these tools, especially the open tools. And when we heard that great talk just before lunch, drawing on Overton, and you know, we hear also, I'll talk as well about things like Open Alex, which in a sense open up the capacity of many people in the system to do meta-science. So this is one of my few slides with lots of words, but just to sort of nail the definitional thing, I will argue, we argue indeed, and Rory argues as a thing that, you know, meta-science has deep roots. It's not new. It has many branches. It's also experiencing a fresh burst of growth, and there are new shoots, to continue the analogy, appearing in many parts of the global research system. It's not a discipline. It's unhelpful to characterize it as such. It's better understood as an orientation, a way of engaging with questions that we all bump up against periodically in our careers. And they, as I say, I won't read all that out. They may be questions about the governance, evaluation, communication of research, etc., etc. All the things that we see people working on in a meta-science. Many researchers, and indeed research funders and research professionals, choose at various points of their career to devote time, energy, and research capacity to those questions. That doesn't require them to sort of rebrand themselves or sort of self-identify as meta-scientists. We were selling T-shirts last week at the conference saying, "I'm a meta-scientist," which actually sold out very fast. It was interesting. So there are a lot of people who want to self-identify as meta, at least at the level of wearing the T-shirt. But an important part of our message was that you don't have to, you know, be a meta-scientist to do meta-science. And I think that's quite a liberating thing, particularly for earlier career colleagues, you know, because it's hard to build a career in this stuff. I mean, Diana and I have, but, you know, there aren't that many. You know, the volume of stuff going on massively exceeds the number of jobs in the narrow field itself. And so it's important to see it in those sense. Anyway, that's meta-science. I'm straying off. Let me get back to funders. Another thing we did last week was launch the Meta-Science Alliance. This is a new, I say we, not Rory, but a lot of the people at the conference. Giopi is a signatory as well. I'm looking for your logo on here. It's not there. It should be. Anyway, it should be. Yeah. Well, anyway, Sergio signed it, but that slide is missing his logo. I apologize for that. That's an oversight. But imagine it's there. Among the others, these were the organizations that signed up to coincide with the launch. So you can see it's a mix of research groups, funders, and other sort of infrastructure providers and others. This is intended to be a light touch kind of attempt to bring more coherence, coordination, community building to this big, disparate, baggy space. And it's still very early days, and any organization is welcome to join. You just grab me afterwards or send an email to the Centre for Open Science. So it's very early days, but it's just trying to, not control or direct this space, which would be impossible, but to just bring a bit more coordination to it. And it was very nice to see those of you that have seen this week's Nature. Their lead editorial is on the Meta-Science Alliance and on the conference last week, and they're basically saying it's a good idea, but that meta-science needs to make sure it's actually useful, that we don't just talk to one another, particularly the academics, but we make it a useful enterprise, which I think links to my point about funders. So that's my first point. So that's the longest one. The others are shorter. In addition to funders becoming more active participants in the meta-science movement, we also see a growing number of funders becoming engaged as sites of experimentation, encouraging and supporting experiments and other mixed method approaches to evidence gathering, evidence synthesis across their work. And this is a very, very dynamic, interesting space. I mean, Kay mentioned some examples from the US that he'd been involved in setting up. This picture down here, but this is Michael Nielsen, who recently was at the Asteria Institute, and he writes very well about this stuff, and he has a nice picture there, if you can see it, which sort of basically argues that all of the approaches we use to fund research and innovation sort of sit in that little yellow blob, and we somehow fail to engage with the numerous other possibilities that are out there. I mean, I think that might be a slightly extreme version of the case, but there's certainly something in that. So it's been very interesting to see experimentation kind of rise up funder agendas in recent years. We've been working on this since Rory was set up 6 years ago. We published 3 years ago now this Experimental Research Funders Handbook, which was bringing together the evidence from a sort of early round of funders. And we now have this thing called a FIRE, this accelerator for innovation and research funding experimentation. So when a funder wants to do experiments, but they need support in the design of an experiment, in thinking through some of the practical aspects, maybe also in thinking about the kind of PR and how to sort of manage their stakeholders, we have a sort of team that are there to try and help them to do that, and then also help them to evaluate the results. In the first sort of wave of all of this, going back to 10 years now and running through, we saw a lot of interest in partial randomization, use of lottery-type mechanisms, and there were a number of European funders that were very active and continue to be active in that. Thank you. SNSF, Swiss National Science Foundation, one example who we work with, FWF and others, and some great work through that. Volkswagen Foundation had this experiment initiative. British Academy has more recently started doing this, so there's lots of interest in that field. We wrote a lot about this, and I think it's been good to see all of that. At the same time, I think there's a sense that to really progress the application of those methods and mechanisms, one needs to be more ambitious and more sort of rigorous in how we design these studies, sort of baselines that we put in place, rather than doing sort of more and more of these very small-scale pilots, which we have seen. So in a UK sense, that's partly what the UK Meta-Science Unit will try to do. We've written about this. There was a paper we did a couple of years ago on where next for partial randomization, if you're interested. The thing that we're involved with at the moment that has generated a sort of fresh wave of interest is distributed peer review. So this is a different intervention, one where in a given grant call, all of the applicants to that call also undertake to act as reviewers of 3 or 4 applications, and the idea is to see whether introducing that fairly modest change at the sort of micro level of a particular call can deal with some of the problems that funders experience in the review system, particularly problems of A, how to secure high-quality reviewers, and B, even if you do secure them, how to get them to return the review on time. I know I'm very guilty of often not doing that. And so, again, there's lots of material. We published this recently as a guide to distributed peer review. These are the sort of potential benefits, which, again, I won't go through: ease of recruitment, faster time to grant, et cetera, et cetera. And we've done this experiment on this with the Volkswagen Foundation, which is still ongoing. We've done the first couple of rounds, and we're continuing that, which has shown largely positive results. The UK system then has repeated. They sort of drew on the method we developed with Volkswagen, and they've done it in the UK. I won't go through because of time all of this. This is all in the government report, but to skip to the good bit, the results, they estimate that running, this is the UK government, the UKRI, running distributed peer review on this call led to a 53 to 65% improvement in the speed and efficiency of the review process. You can see the cut time from submission to decision from 4.6 to 6.3 to 2.2 months, and it saved a significant administrative effort overall. So, I mean, this isn't a panacea, and there are some grant calls where you wouldn't want to do this, particularly if it's a very sort of inter-transdisciplinary topic and you want inputs from people who wouldn't be applicants, But in certain contexts, this is an example of a very modest process change that, as you see, can potentially lead to a 50% plus improvement in efficiency. And this is the kind of stuff that, gets meta-scientists excited. So there's a bit more there. The other thing that is obviously hot, as it is in every sphere of life, is uses of AI in research funding and assessment. And we published, just before Meta-Science 25, our new handbook. This is a follow-on to the last one, called Funding by Algorithm. And this is a handbook for research funders who are grappling with how, where, when, in what ways to use AI, machine learning techniques in different aspects of funding and evaluation. We also did an updated survey of the public funders who are members of the Global Research Council. You can see there. I'm just speeding up because I've got not enough time. But here you see in the middle there, an example. So La Caixa Foundation, they're one of the big foundations in Spain, many of you know them, based in Barcelona. And they have been trialing with a sort of A/B model, use of an LLM that they've trained on their existing grant portfolio to not to select at the top, so they're not using it to choose the grants they give, but to lop off the bottom 25% of weakest proposals. And that's shown so far a very good correlation in STEM fields. It's a bit wobblier as you move into social sciences, and it's even wobblier as you move into humanities. But it's an interesting experiment, and we're now working with various funders to do more of this kind of thing. You see there as well, that's a report from Google DeepMind, and they are an example of some of the private sector actors who are they have a meta science team in Google DeepMind in London, and they're doing lots of work. So I won't go through this is in the report, but let me speed up quickly to my third point. Funders as investors in novel infrastructures. This is Jon Arne Rottingen, who is the chief executive of the Wellcome Trust. Wellcome Trust, our biggest foundation in the UK. It spends 1.6 billion British pounds a year on research. Jon Arne was the former head of the Research Council of Norway, so it's for us, at least the first time we've had a Norwegian running the Wellcome Trust. And he gave another keynote last week, and he announced a whole set of concrete steps that Wellcome was taking to support various open infrastructures for meta-science, including signing up to the Barcelona Declaration on open research information, which is a commitment to make the underlying metadata and research data more openly available, and a £3 million investment in OpenAlex, as a concrete attempt to improve that infrastructure. And I mean, Wellcome aren't alone. I put one other example there. In the Netherlands, NWO and others are also doing a lot of work to support infrastructures in this area. So, this is another very active area. We've been trying to get the funders we work with to think more as a group about how they can mobilize resource to support infrastructure development. Because, of course, it's not something that should be happening at individual nation level. It needs to happen globally. And in Rory, we've done our own bits of infrastructure development as well. We launched last November MetaRaw, which is a new peer review platform for meta research. Ludo Waltman and Kathy Ziller are the two editors-in-chief. And so this is modeled on the kind of peer community in eLife model, where you separate out, review, publish, curate functions. And so you could still put something on MetaRaw, and ultimately it could end up in a journal, or it could just live on MetaRaw, or, there are various options. So that's, again, growing fast, and we encourage any of you who are active researchers in this space to consider MetaRaw as a place to do peer review of your work, wherever it ends up being published after. There are challenges, of course. I mean, eLife has had a real difficult time being delisted by Web of Science, and we could, again, talk about all of that. So it's very important that we try and ensure that these novel infrastructures don't get squeezed out by incumbent interests. And then the other thing we're doing is we've built this funder data platform, which Wellcome Trust built for us originally, and that's just a mechanism by which multiple funders can share data to allow analysis on a given question across different funding systems. And we published just recently the first big product of that work, led by Vincent Trag at Leiden. And so what we did here was we took two recent studies, individual studies of Matthew effects in particular research systems that were in the literature, and we essentially did a larger scale replication across 12 different funding agencies with much, much larger data sets. So you can see here the larger study of its kind shows, and essentially it showed that the findings were broadly correct. It sort of validated them, but on a much larger scale basis. And, so again, I mean, this isn't, it's not like all replication type stuff. It's not groundbreaking new research, but it's important research, because a lot of features of what we see happening in research systems are system dependent. So it is important, for us, the reason we work comparatively is that very often, it's quite important to be able to compare and tension national outcomes with what's happening in other systems. Funders assessment, I'm nearly done. Funders assessment, funders as shapers of research. You see, I came on an all-night flight from London, losing the ability to speak. But anyway, funders as shapers of research assessment reform. we've seen over the past 10, 12 years now this growing movement for research assessment reform, and of course it's had a strong voice in Latin America through FOLEC and other groups. Judith Sutz is here and others in the room who've been involved in that. I've contributed to the Metric Tide Review in the UK, and of course Diana with the Leiden Manifesto, which is a very important piece in all of this. So that sort of movement's been growing in various ways, and funders are becoming much more actively involved. I say we've been working particularly with the Global Research Council as a mechanism of working with 150 or so public funders globally, and you can see some of the work we've been doing there with them. We just published in May, and we launched it at the GRC meeting in Riyadh, an updated survey of where funders are at on all this stuff, which I'll just show a couple of slides from quickly. You can see here which things they're signing up to as statements or principles of commitment. And you can see also that, established indicators, measures, proxies for research quality remain dominant, but there is a gradual evolution, a gradual shift that's visible where other factors around impact and research culture and other things are becoming more visible, which again I won't go through now because of time. We have this project called Agora, which is looking at all of this and relating very directly to research assessment reform in a number of specific countries. We're working with 13 countries on this, and here are a few of them, countries which are all going through a reform of their assessment process. I'm nearly done. So New Zealand, Australia, they're all redesigning their assessment system. Ukraine, we had the Minister, Denis Kurbatov, spoke very passionately at the end of Metascience 25 last week on the screen. Obviously, he didn't come to London because of the war, but even amidst all the challenges of the war in Ukraine, they are also introducing a new research assessment system. I'm not sure it would be my priority in the middle of a war, but anyway, it's good to see, and we're helping them with that. So there's lots going on. We continue to have arguments about this in our own system in the UK, but I was just going to flag this because it relates to Diana's work, so it's a nice lead up to Diana's talk now. Diana published this very influential paper in 2012 on performance-based university research funding systems in research policy, which I'm sure many of you have read. Very important piece in this field. And we've just published this new typology, which in a sense kind of builds on and sort of tries to expand Diana's framework to sort of deal with some of what we now see happening in research assessment globally. So that's up on the Rory website if you're interested. And the diagram there shows some of the elements of that typology. We have this atlas as well online of different assessment systems, so you can sort of dive into the map and see different countries, and Brazil is in there, I'm pleased to say, among others, but we're going to be adding more countries over time. So assessment systems, so funders are becoming more important actors in this. And finally, and I'm going to end very shortly on this, my negative one, funders in crisis, funders struggling to maintain legitimacy and social license. I mean, we've heard already a fair bit about this. We'll hear more in a minute. I won't go into the details of what's happening in the States. I mean, only to say again that it isn't, of course, unique to the US. I mean, we've gone through a less acute, but still quite difficult period similar to this that affected science funding as a consequence of Brexit. You've had your challenges here, of course, with the previous government. Whenever I talk to funders across Europe, there's real concern in Germany, in the Netherlands, in many countries about the rise of populist movements, the rise of the far right, and what it might mean for the science system over the medium. And we look with horror on what's happening in Washington as one version of what might happen elsewhere. So it's a difficult time. I don't have the answers to this. For the meta-science movement, it's been interesting as well to see how many of the agendas and priorities of the science reform movement have themselves been sort of weaponized in service of this agenda. And I'd be interested, Kay, in your thoughts on this. So the White House executive order on restoring gold standard science, which uses a lot of the language of open science reform, but is also being kind of brought into arguments for why it makes sense to cut, the NIH budget in half. So again, we could talk about this if we have time in question. There are some people, attacking the science reform movement as if it should have sort of, 20 years ago when we started talking about open science, we should have anticipated this moment, which I think is a deeply unfair and rather unhelpful accusation, but it is being leveled in some quarters. I think, the answer in all of this is not to brush under the carpet problems in science. That's not going to help anyone. It's not going to help the funding of science over the long term, even if there are bad faith actors who want to use those arguments to cut science funding, I think we have no choice other than to continue shining a light on areas where science needs to improve and live up to its own stated standards. And, we also, taking a historical sweep, one of my favorite history of science books of all time, well, his favorite book titles at least, this Steve Shaping collection, Never Pure, reminding us that, historical studies of science, as if it was produced by people with bodies situated in time, space, cultural society, struggling for credibility and authority, which, is what we're all going through. Dan Sarevitz wrote a very nice piece about this a few years ago as well, basically saying, we have no choice other than to come out and, as it were, climb off our pedestal a bit and become more accountable. Within meta-science, I have a colleague in the UK who runs the Economic Social Research Council called Stian Westlake, who draws this very nice distinction between what he calls Apollonian and Dionysian meta-science. So those of you that aren't up with your Greek mythology, the Apollonian model being one that is logical and ordered and sort of builds in a sort of evidentiary way. So very much sort of stuff that people like me do, and many of us in the room do. And that's probably the dominant brand of meta-science. And then you've also got this Dionysian strand, which is more playful, chaotic, and at times destructive in a deliberate way. So it sort of says, well, science isn't working, let's burn it down. And you see that flavor coming through strongly in aspects of the sort of Doge, MAGA movement. And even, there are people in meta-science in the US who make that case. So, to finish, we wrote a piece yesterday based on the conference call, this is in Research Professional UK, saying meta-science's challenge is to keep its big tent intact. I am a strong believer in that model of meta-science. I think there is still, despite all these challenges, and funders are a very important part of that tent. So I'll leave it at that. I hope that's helpful. Look forward to Diana and to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I think that we are going to ask Diana to do your presentation, and then at the end we can have some questions, please.
Thank you. So yes, I've been tasked with talking about what's happening in the United States, which, as my slide says, it's a lot. So I'm actually going to start with my first slide is going to be about all the things I don't have time to talk about, whiz through those, and then I'm going to divide my talk into 3 sections, talking about some letters that flew around, the core on research funding and what's happening on research funding, and then some on what might be coming, looking at the administration philosophy. And I have to say, this isn't based on research. I'm even further outside the government than Kay is, so I am just reading the headlines and summarizing it all for you. All right, so things I don't have time to talk about, so many things happening. Of course, there was mass firings across the U.S. government, including staff at the science agencies, including scientists at other agencies. Public data has been taken down. Example, patents view data from the Patent Office, which was a crushing blow for one of my colleagues who used to be the chief economist at the Patent Office and set that operation up. There are groups around the world working to archive and maintain that data. Conferences have been hit. Well-publicized issues at the border have dissuaded people, especially Europeans, who I think are not used to having issues at the U.S. border, from coming. So we held a conference in May in my school, and of course no Canadians came. Canadians are not interested in this whole 51st state talk, so they're boycotting America. And out of like 250 people were there, and 50 people didn't come. So that's the kind of effect it was having on us. International students, of course, there's going to be problems there. They're a huge part of our PhD cohorts, and there's issues with getting visas. Visa interviews for students were stopped for a month, I don't know how long, and then restarted, so that's thrown a problem into the people coming for this coming academic year, and their tracking in websites and stuff has shown that interest in U.S. graduate degrees has decreased, so we'll see how that plays out as well. So, things I can talk about. First, there were letters. February, this letter went out from the Department of Education to all universities, reminding universities that discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin is illegal and morally reprehensible. And further on saying, you know, in recent years, American universities have been discriminating against students on the basis of race, especially white and Asian students, a lot of whom come from disadvantaged backgrounds. So don't do that anymore. So this is the basis, this letter is the basis of American universities panicking about their DEI efforts and getting rid of those. My university, Georgia Institute of Technology, we're in a conservative state. So a few years ago, we could see the writing on the wall, as we say in English. And so when our director of our diversity office retired, they didn't replace him. And they kind of moved the functions around. So now somewhere at the university, there is a Institute of Compliance and Opportunity. So that's how my university has dealt with that. So then the next letter, April 1st, a letter to the American people from fellows of the national academies. They signed this individually, so not on behalf of the national academies, but just in their capacity as important luminary scientists. They were saying, you know, for 80 years, the US government has made wise investments, built up our research enterprise, made it the envy of the world, you know, the standard way American scientists talk about American science. But astoundingly, the Trump administration is destabilizing it, gutting funding, firing scientists, removing access to data, pressuring researchers to abandon their work. We call on the administration to cease its wholesale assault on US science, and we urge the public to join this call. Notice the date on that, April 1st. Notice it comes before everything else I'm going to talk about in my talk. And there's a lot going on in America. You know, the deportation issues are making the news, this other things, and that big bill, and how they're going to cut Medicaid. So anyway, so this kind of came and went. They've already said science is destroyed. They've used their voice. Nothing happened. So not sure that, to me, I'm a bit naive, but didn't seem the most politically astute move. On the other hand, an ongoing effort, I think scientific societies have organized, and they're getting scientists who often come, well, they come from all around the country, even though they work in the big cities. As Kay said, things are very concentrated in science, but they come from everywhere. And so scientific societies are encouraging scientists to write editorial letters to their hometown newspapers about what scientific work is like and what it does for the people in the country. And that, they've got 200 of those out so far, and I think that's ongoing, which seems like a more astute approach. So anyways, like I said, that was all before, on April 11th, when 3 government agencies signed off on a letter to Harvard. Of course, Harvard, you know, the university's university, right? But they're going after Harvard. The first letter called for Harvard to reform its governance, its hiring, its admissions, its diversity efforts, its student discipline. There's going to be auditing. The government's going to be tracking it. Harvard's going to be reporting to the government. Long letter. And that was only letter number 1. May 5th came letter number 2 from the Secretary of the Department of Education, otherwise known as maybe the crazy letter, talking about Harvard's privilege, their so-called students, hate, in capitalized, grants was also capitalized, so many questions about Harvard. It's a mockery. They benefit from taxpayer largesse, humiliating plagiarism scandal. That was a reference to their former president who left under a cloud which included accusations of plagiarism in their earlier work. Harvard, an embarrassment, disastrous management, betrayed ideals. So, yeah, that letter was so crazy that the administration later said it was sent out in error or something. But nevertheless, so on May 12th, Harvard responds, the president, with exactly the kind of letter you'd expect from, you know, sound administration, you know, we have common ground, we all want to end anti-Semitism and bigotry, and indeed, Harvard has completed a report on anti-Semitism problems at Harvard and on anti-Muslim bias at Harvard. They've completed these 2 reports. They're doing a lot of soul searching because they did find that they did have problems and that they need to be addressed. So they agree with all of that, and they're doing something. You know, they agree that we want to foster freedom of thought and expression. We want to embrace multiple viewpoints, because the administration is accusing Harvard of only hiring liberal professors. You know, and Harvard is saying, you know, we agree we want continued global leadership. We agree we should follow the law. You know, that first letter is government overreach. Harvard has constitutional freedoms. You're ignoring the compliance we're doing. We're already doing meaningful change, and we will see you in court. Very American, of course. But also, it's what's happening quite broadly with all these efforts. People are fighting them all by taking the government to court. So Harvard is taking the government to court. So the next day, 1,000 of Harvard's federal research grants were terminated, worth $2.4 billion. Now, they've also terminated a lot. Before they went to Harvard, they started on Columbia. And there's an interesting thing there, because I think it's like $400 million that they've terminated out of Columbia, which apparently equals the amount that Donald Trump was asking Columbia to pay for a parcel of land in New York City when he was in his real estate developer days in the 70s or 80s. He wanted to sell a parcel of land for $400 million, and Columbia refused. Interestingly, then, $400 million has now disappeared from their budget, from, you know, federal money. Okay, so research funding. A little bit of history on research funding in America. Before World War II, funding was very, very low for research in America, because Congress has a very practical attitude. They were like, how would this help farmers in my district? If it doesn't, I'm not interested. So there really wasn't a lot of support for research. And, you know, like whereas the Russian Tsar was building a very elaborate, glorious astronomical observatory, the American Navy managed to smuggle in a very modest effort as a depot of charts and instruments, you know, not telling Congress it was actually an observatory. I mean, that was the kind of level at which things operated. So then came World War II, and American scientists were very visibly responsible for a huge number of things, which the American public was very well aware of. You know, the atomic bomb, radar, jet engines, computers, penicillin, DDT, all of these things. Huge advances, very highly visible. So very impressive for Congress and for the American public. So the nation came out of that war agreeing that America needed a strong research enterprise. And the result was the funding went up from 1940, before the war, 47 after, federal funding increased a lot. Well, and as part of this, one of the organizers of the effort during the war, Vannevar Bush, who was president of MIT, was asked by the president to write a report about how research should be organized in the country going forward. And so he wrote 75 years ago, or 76 now, or whatever, he wrote the report, Science, the Endless Frontier, which laid out to the value to the nation of research and how we should organize it afterwards. And the it's kind of an interesting cultural element here, that title, The Endless Frontier, because the frontier had been central to the American character. You know, since the time the country was settled, America had been defined by expanding westward. And so American identity was defined by this challenge and overcoming these challenges. Well, eventually the frontier ran out. And this was, you know, significantly before 1945, but yet the echoes, I think, were still faint in the culture about that worry, because it was a great anxiety for America. No more frontier. Who are we as a people without those challenges? American identity was threatened. So anyway, so decades went by, and, you know, it wasn't such a big issue anymore, but just enough that Bush could recall it within his title here and say, we don't ever have to worry about the frontier running out. We can take on the challenge of the scientific frontier, and it will never run out. So what we're seeing at this time was scientists were, in a sense, agents of sensibilities common to all. So that kind of widespread feeling that we need to support science, and it's very important for our culture, our national identity even, was so pervasive and strong there. And so that's some of the sense you're seeing in America with that like campaign for scientists to write letters to their hometown newspapers, that maybe we haven't paid enough attention to that right now. Maybe that's a little bit a part of what's going on. So trying to rebuild that a little is something that's in the narrative. So it was very successful. Of course, the U.S. post-war scientific establishment, the money rose pretty much continually, with little dips now and then, right through most recent years. Now, to understand the budget, we have to go back to something I first learned from Kay's early work, that the federal budget, there's a really important distinction in there, that a lot of the federal budget is mandatory. So the Congress can't vote unless they do something significant like cut Social Security. There's a lot of it that they can't really touch. Science is in the discretionary part of the budget, which is that little green slice. I mean, the military is also a discretionary part, but they only ever want to increase that. So the only cuts really can be concentrated in that little green slice there out of the whole budget. Because the mandatory parts of the budget, the fixed parts, are things like Social Security, pension for the old people, Medicare, health care for the old people, the interest on the federal debt growing all the time. So a lot of mandatory spending. That's by far the majority of the budget. And over the years, that slice of the budget is just increasing. So science is in this discretionary part, which is increasingly squeezed, and as you can see on the right-hand part of this graph, it's a small part of that discretionary budget. So this is the problem science has always faced, and it'll just get worse. Is in the small part of the budget, which is the only part that Congress actually has discretion to cut when it wants to save money. So to talk about the funding, I'm going to reach into The Economist. They did this cover, at least on their American edition in May, and they graphed up some of the figures quite nicely. So grants have been terminated. As of May, 3,000 grants had been terminated because the administration can do that. It's hard to know how many grants are active, so I've estimated, I think maybe around 186,000 grants at NIH and NSF are active. So those 3,000 NIH and NSF grants that have been terminated are maybe about 1.6%. They are concentrated, however. I've done a Wordle here of the titles of NIH's terminated grants. And you can see there's a lot here to do with minorities, disparities, racial things. So there's DEI stuff. The transgenders, of course, is in there. Underserved, things like that they're cutting because they don't and no longer effectuate the priorities of this administration, is the words they use. Also, they're cutting the COVID stuff because COVID's over. So we don't need that anymore. So there we are. And the same with the NSF and the titles of their grants. Again, and pretty much it seemed like they were doing this on a keyword search of the grant abstracts and whatnot. So titles with equity, diversity, inclusion, underrepresented, indigenous, black, women, participation, community, all these things are the kind of things they're preferentially cutting. So of course, the terminated grants then as a whole look discriminatory because grants with PIs whose PIs are women were more likely to be cut than you'd expect given their share of the overall grant pool, whereas grants to men with PIs as men or men as PIs were less likely to be cut than you'd expect given their overall share in the pool, and grants with black PIs much more likely to be cut than you'd expect, and grants with white PIs, much less likely to be cut. So, and I think some of this has been turned around in court precisely because it's discriminatory, or at least put on hold. So then looking forward, as Kay said, the budget, they're now to thrash this out. Well, the budget process starts with the administration sending to Congress their proposal of the budget. So this is the proposal that President Trump has made, which involves cutting NSF's budget by 50%, NIH's budget budget by a third, NASA and NOAA science budgets by a quarter. So now the thing about it is, Trump did this every year in his first term. And the first year, there was a lot of panic and articles about it, but then Congress just did what it always did. So nobody paid any attention after that. Now, of course, everybody's paying a lot of attention again because we don't know what Congress is going to do. Because Congress hasn't shown any appetite to stand up against the president. And they passed that big bill, which is going to, hugely inflate the deficit, which a lot of those Republican congressmen would otherwise stand against, and they didn't. So it's very unclear this time around what will happen. And it'll be coming out over the next couple of months. And if they can't agree a budget, they'll continue on the level they're spending now, which we're already continuing on this level we're spending from last year. So, okay, so on the second graph there is where America would be in the spending ranked if these budget cuts took place. So, China's spending the most now, EU second, and we're third. And of course, if these cuts took place, we'd still be third, just a diminished third. And that's not the only change, because the federal agencies have announced they're going to fund in future a flat 15% overhead rate. So when you get a grant into a university in the U.S., you get your direct costs, how much you're paying for your salaries and your students and their tuition and your equipment, and then you add an overhead rate of, on some of the costs, 50 to 60%. So it ends up maybe 30 to 40% the full value of the grant. It goes to the university for basically keeping the lights on, running the library, keeping up the physical plant, these things. So universities have always accepted 15% overhead from foundations because the foundations say it's because the government is subsidizing those operations. Well, now the government is saying you accept it from the foundations, we're only paying 15% in the future. Of course, it's being challenged in court. Somebody could see this coming because in the last year's budget bill, which we're still operating under, and if I can't agree another budget, it'll roll forward like that, is written in that the NIH is not allowed to change its overhead rate from what has been negotiated. So it's actually written into the budget law, NIH can't make this change. So of course, universities are suing the government on that basis. So I don't know if that change has managed to be implemented or not. Universities who are subject to the other agencies like my university, and would really be hurt by those rates changing, are going to court on more procedural grounds, like the government didn't announce this change early enough and takes comment and whatever they're all supposed to do. So again, that's all being fought out. Universities are super panicked about this stuff. But in fact, on my university, as of June 5th, because they've been sending us emails every month on what's going on, and they keep reminding us that we have 3,500 active grants and 44 have been canceled. And since February, we have also obtained 386 new awards. So that's what it looks like from my office. Now, also, my university has spent $400,000 on supporting students on those canceled projects, because this has been the big problem when projects have been terminated, is you've got students in the middle of their PhDs, and you have an obligation to them. So that's the first thing that universities care about, is finding money for those students so that they can move through and graduate. Of course, we're looking forward, because all of this stuff, which is up in the air, the 15%, the budget cuts, so there's a lot of institute-wide contingency and scenario planning going on, apparently. But my university reassures me that Georgia Tech Research Enterprise remains relevant and vital. So we'll see. I mean, actually, it was funny when the very early days, back in February, when noises started to be made about stuff happening, there was all this kind of town hall meetings and hand-holding meetings, and, some professors, especially the liberal arts, wanted to know, where were the ramparts? They wanted to mount the ramparts. And the president eventually made clear there will be no ramparts. I think this was just at the stage of that first DEI letter, because the president said, Georgia Tech has this, $1 billion coming to it from the federal government every year for research. Whatever the requirements are to maintain eligibility for federal research grants, we will meet those requirements. Bottom line, right? So the professors was like, because wanted to fight the DEI stuff, and they're like, no, we depend too much on this. So we will not be arguing over DEI with President Trump. Okay, so, another thing that's been happening a lot, if you're working on, if you're a consultant working on contract for the federal government, you're in trouble. One of my friend's husbands has been retired because he works in a consulting agency that's doing a lot of federal work, and that's not there anymore, so he's lost his job. So the national academies, here's an example, is their studies are funded by the federal government, and they've lost 43 contracts, so 15% of their federal budget, which is 80% of their total budget. So they've laid off 50 people out of their 1,000 staff. They're also doing a reorganization, which is, now the interesting thing about the reorganization is the president of the National Academies has said she wanted to do this 9 years ago when she came in, but everything was going well, so she couldn't do it. But now she can do it. So she wants to move from an organization that's costly, unwieldy, and inefficient to one with lower overhead rates, that's leaner, faster, and gives more relevant advice. So they're reorganizing from 5 disciplinary units they set up way back when into problem-focused centers, one on health, people, and places, and the other on advancing science and technology. Okay, so my final section, the administration's philosophy. So I'm doing this by looking at the president's science advisors. And what science advisors typically look like. They look like senior scientists who had run serious operations. So under the Trump 1, he actually appointed the first non-physicist into that role, a meteorologist, who had been the Secretary of Science and Technology in the state of Oklahoma and been on the National Science Board. Biden appointed a woman, again senior, back into the physics realm, who had been director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology and DARPA and all these things. So Trump 2 appoints a 38-year-old who has a bachelor's degree, and has been in banking and finance. But also, he has been chief of staff for Peter Thiel, which is probably the qualification for the job. Peter Thiel is a Silicon Valley entrepreneur guy who started PayPal with Elon Musk. Elon Musk, of course, was running the Department of Government Efficiency, who has ferreted out data on U.S. citizens and sent it to Palantir, which is an AI, blah, blah, company of Peter Thiel. So Peter Thiel was also the godfather of Krassios, the new science advisor's career, and also the political rise of our Vice President, J.D. Vance. So he is kind of a power behind the throne here. Okay, so how do these people look at science? This was Trump 1, Drogemeyer, these guys give speeches, the National Academies or the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and so I've done a wordle of their speeches. And so it's typical, these speeches talking about how great science is and how this administration is going to unleash discovery, build workforce, advance values, telling you the 5 great things the president has done for science, things like that. So this is very in line with those kind of speeches. This is the Biden administration science advisor talking about technology, science, research, aspirations, advances. Spent a third of that speech celebrating scientific successes, and then say this administration is going to help science by spending more, getting more impact. The new directorate, the TIPS directorate, the CHIPS directorate, sent bold goals, the cancer moonshot, the ARPA-H. We're going to education, workforce training, equity and ethics permeating it all. So all great stuff, right? Classic. And then we got the new guy, Krassios. He gets up, look at his speech. It's all focused, inward focused on science, right? Science. Science has a problem. Science needs to be reinvigorated. He spent his talk focusing not on how great science is, but on the problems of science. The declining productivity of research, there's been some famous papers on that, a fraudulent paper issue that wasn't retracted for 5 years, very exercised about school closures during COVID, which were quite long in the country, and these schools, he says, was closed even though children were known not to suffer badly from COVID and not to be vectors of COVID, and we can see there's been a lot, actually, about the harm done to children's education through those closures. So, science getting slapped on the wrist, right? And this is all about fixing science. So we've come up with this gold standard science thing. Executive order came out. We're going to restore public trust in science, ensure that policy making addresses scientific findings for demonstrable outcomes for the public. We're going to have reproducible, transparent, falsifiable science, unbiased peer reviewer, clear about errors, skeptical of assumptions, collaborative, accepting negative results, free from conflicts of interest. That's what this administration wants, gold standard science, which again, it all sounds like what it should be. But, this is the thing. Is, as Republicans say, gold standard science going to create a path to rebuild trust between the scientific community and the public through common sense principles? Because the Biden administration filled science with DEI programs, woke ideology, and politicized science? Or is it going to protect employees from efforts to prevent or deter consideration of alternative opinions, like on groupthink, on climate changes and COVID-19? You want to stop the groupthink? Or is this effort going to empower political appointees to override conclusions and interpretations of the government scientists, to threaten their professional autonomy, and undermine the scientific capacity of research and regulatory agencies? That's the worry of people on the other side of the political spectrum. Londra Nelson, most notably, who has resigned from the National Science Board, overall what's going on at NSF, who says the Trump administration is systematically defunding the American research ecosystem while disingenuously promising a return to so-called gold standard science. So we do know the Trump administration wants to ensure unquestioned scientific and technological global dominance. That's what they want, dominance. This is a very chump way of talking about science. They have stated the priorities are artificial intelligence, quantum, nuclear, and biotechnology, which to me looks like Peter Thiel's investment list. And it makes no sense for Republicans to say that because, Republicans have always been about, we don't want to compete with industry, we only want to fund the things the industry won't fund, right? So it's completely backwards to be funding the things that Peter Thiel is investing in, whatever. So early days, surprisingly early days, if you count them up, considering everything that's happened. And what will Congress do? That's our big question, But the story is definitely going to continue. We definitely live in interesting times, which, as we all know, we think is a curse out of China. And boy, they were so right about that.
Thank you, Diana. Was interesting. I'm sure that you could have the whole afternoon just discussing some of these two the points that were brought. First, one presentation that showed that some areas are blooming, and others that we see that a big cloud and what's coming on. I think in the interest of time, we'll just have the two questions, just two short questions, please, and because we have some other people to talk to. Okay, anyone? Well, yeah, people, I think it's under the impact of the, yeah. Well, maybe then I'm gonna do a short question, then I ask for both if they can come. I saw, James, from your presentation showing that the area, at least of meta-science, although it's nothing to bring a shirt, is something that is really going up. So since the country which has usually the big ecosystem in the world is going on, can you see how this will affect the globe? And then later I'm going to ask if Diana can also mention about this.
how meta-science will affect the...
Yeah, well, what's the fact that you can
Yeah.
think about this?
Well, I mean, I think the effects will be different in different places. I mean, I think the overall trend is obviously for, more activity, more people engaging, not only from across research, as I showed with that picture of all the dots, but also, I think, as I tried to say, a growing number of funding agencies, foundations, policymakers and others who are, more explicitly seeing themselves as part of this bigger effort to both understand the inner workings of the science system and to direct that knowledge towards intervening and improving the science system in various ways. I mean, the US is a complicated, whether that's now accounted, well, there's many, many things going on in the US as there are many things going on in most countries. I think it's quite unclear. There were a lot of meta-science things happening in the federal funding system, as Kay mentioned, NIH and NSF. I mean, amidst all the turmoil, how much of that continues or doesn't, he would be better placed to say than me. I think, I suppose that the challenge, whatever happens with Congress and the budget in the US, is clearly there's no escaping this being an incredibly disruptive period for American science. I guess that the meta-science challenge in all of that is, what can be done to actually, in a substantive and good faith way, use this in different contexts to try and improve the system in the future. I mean, I think it's a tough challenge in the current climate, but I don't mean the kind of weaponizing the language and using it to undermine, but actually saying, well, how can we, if there is going to be a smaller NIH, how can we therefore make sure the NIH, works better and better serves the health needs of the American people and the world or whatever. But,
okay, Diana, would you like to comment what your particular opinion about how this will affect the whole system?
Well, I don't know. It's so hard to know. Time will tell. And I think meta-science will have a role to play documenting whatever those effects are and really establishing them and getting beyond the anecdotes to see systematically what happens. It's going to take time for it to all work out, but I think meta-science will have the tools to show us what the effects are.
Okay, then I thank you both for the presentations, and we go to the next session. Thanks a lot.